June 1941, the forests of Ukraine. A lone Soviet cook, armed with nothing but an axe, spots a German Panzer tank rolling toward his position. Most soldiers would run. Ivan Pavlovich Sereda charged straight at it. What happened next sounds impossible, yet it's one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in World War II. This is the story of a man who turned kitchen duty into a legend and proved that heroes don't always carry rifles. Ivan Pavlovich Sereda was born in 1999 in the Poltava region of Ukraine, a land of vast wheat fields and tight-knit farming communities. Like many young men of his generation, Sereda grew up working the land, developing the kind of physical strength that came from long days of manual labor. He wasn't a career soldier or a trained warrior. Before the war, Sereda worked as a cook, a profession that would seem far removed from the front lines of combat. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Sereda was serving as a cook in the 91st Tank Regiment of the Soviet Army. The German invasion caught the Soviet forces off guard, and within hours, chaos erupted across the western territories of the Soviet Union. The 91st Tank Regiment, like many Soviet units, found itself scrambling to respond to the lightning-fast German advance. For Sereda, the war had arrived without warning. One moment he was preparing meals for his fellow soldiers. The next he was thrust into a desperate fight for survival. The German Wehrmacht was pushing deep into Soviet territory, and every soldier, regardless of their role, was needed to slow the advance. Sereda's regiment was positioned in the forests near the Ukrainian-Belarusian border, an area that would soon become a battleground. The thick forests provided some cover, but they also concealed the rapid movement of German tanks and infantry. In these early days of the invasion, confusion reigned, communication lines were cut, supply chains were disrupted, and Soviet units were often isolated and surrounded. Despite being a cook, Sereda understood the gravity of the situation. He had trained with basic weapons, as all Soviet soldiers did, but his primary weapon was a kitchen knife, not a rifle. Yet as the German tanks rolled closer, Sereda made a decision that would define his legacy. He wouldn't run, and he wouldn't hide. On the morning of June 30th, 1941, just 8 days after the German invasion began, Sereda's regiment was engaged in fierce combat near the village of Miropol in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine. The Germans had already advanced deep into Soviet territory, and their panzer divisions were cutting through Soviet defenses with terrifying efficiency. Sereda was at his field kitchen, preparing breakfast for the soldiers who were still alive to eat it. The sounds of battle echoed through the forest, the rumble of tank engines, the crack of rifle fire, and the distant explosions of artillery shells. The front line was fluid and chaotic, with German forces probing for weak points and Soviet units desperately trying to hold their ground. As Sereda worked, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable rumble of a tank engine growing louder. He looked up and saw a German Panzer III tank emerging from the tree line, its turret swiveling as it searched for targets. The tank was heading directly toward the command post of the 91st Tank Regiment, where officers were coordinating the defense. Sereda realized immediately that if the tank reached the command post, it would be catastrophic. The officers would be killed or captured, and the regiment would lose its leadership at a critical moment. But there was no one else nearby to stop it. The Soviet tanks were engaged elsewhere, and the infantry was pinned down by German fire. Sereda looked around for a weapon. His rifle was back in his quarters, and there was no time to retrieve it. All he had was a kitchen axe, a simple tool he used for chopping wood and preparing meat. For a moment, he must have questioned the absurdity of what he was about to do. But in that moment, Ivan Pavlovich Sereda made a choice that would echo through history. He grabbed the axe, stepped out from behind his field kitchen, and began walking toward the tank. The German Panzer III was a formidable machine. Weighing over 20 tons and armed with a 50mm cannon and 2 machine guns, it was designed to dominate the battlefield. Its armor could withstand most small arms fire, and its crew of 5 soldiers were trained to operate as a coordinated unit. To attack such a vehicle with an axe wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. But Sereda wasn't thinking about the odds. He was thinking about his comrades, his regiment, and the command post that needed to be protected. As he approached the tank, he stayed low, using the forest undergrowth for cover. The tank was moving slowly, its crew likely scanning for larger threats like Soviet tanks or anti-tank guns. They weren't expecting a lone soldier with a kitchen tool. Sereda moved quickly, closing the distance between himself and the tank. The Panzer's turret swiveled, its cannon pointing away from him. This was his chance. He sprinted the final few meters and leaped onto the rear of the tank, grabbing onto the exhaust pipes and engine grills to pull himself up. The tank's engine roared beneath him, the heat from the exhaust nearly burning his hands. Sereda climbed onto the top of the hull, his axe gripped tightly in one hand. The tank was still moving, and he had to hold on as it rumbled over the uneven forest floor. Now came the most critical moment. Sereda knew that if he couldn't disable the tank or force the crew to surrender, he would be killed. The tank's crew, sealed inside their steel shell, were initially unaware of his presence, but that wouldn't last long. Sereda positioned himself near the commander's hatch, the circular opening at the top of the turret where the tank commander would sit to observe the battlefield. He raised his axe and brought it down hard against the hatch, the metal-on-metal impact ringing out like a bell. Inside the tank, the crew must have been startled. They could hear the pounding on the hatch, but they didn't know what was happening. Sereda continued to strike the hatch again and again, the blows echoing inside the confined space of the tank. He also began shouting in broken German, demanding that they surrender. The tank came to a halt. The engine idled, and for a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the hatch began to open. What happened next defied all military logic. The German tank crew, realizing they were under attack but unable to see their attacker clearly, believed they were surrounded by Soviet forces. The pounding on the hatch, the shouting, and the sudden appearance of a Soviet soldier on top of their tank created the impression that they were in a far more vulnerable position than they actually were. One by one, the German crewmen emerged from the tank with their hands raised. First came the commander, then the gunner, the loader, the driver, and finally, the radio operator. 5 trained German soldiers, armed and inside one of the most advanced tanks in the world at that time, surrendered to a single Soviet cook armed with an axe. Sereda kept his axe raised, his face stern and his voice commanding. He ordered the Germans to move away from the tank and sit on the ground with their hands behind their heads. The Germans complied, still unsure of how many Soviet soldiers were actually surrounding them. Within minutes, other Soviet soldiers arrived, drawn by the commotion. They were stunned by what they saw. Sereda standing guard over 5 German prisoners, the captured Panzer, 3 sitting idle behind him, and a kitchen axe still in his hand. The Germans, upon realizing they had been captured by a single soldier with an axe, were reportedly humiliated and shocked. One of them, according to witnesses, kept repeating in disbelief, Ein Mann? Ein Mann mit einer Axt? One man? One man with an axe? The captured tank was quickly secured by Soviet forces and examined for intelligence value. The Germans were taken as prisoners of war, and Sereda returned to his duties, though he would never be seen as just a cook again. News of Sereda's incredible feat spread rapidly through the Soviet ranks. In the midst of a devastating invasion, where German forces seemed unstoppable, Sereda's act of courage provided a much-needed morale boost. Soviet propaganda seized on the story, portraying Sereda as an example of the indomitable Soviet spirit and the resourcefulness of the common soldier. On July 17, 1941, just over 2 weeks after the incident, Ivan Pavlovich Sereda was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet Union's highest military honors. The citation specifically mentioned his capture of a German tank with an axe and praised his exceptional courage and initiative. Sereda's story was featured in Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts. Posters were printed showing a heroic figure wielding an axe atop a burning German tank. The propaganda value was immense, but beneath the embellishments was a genuine act of extraordinary bravery. However, like many Soviet heroes of the war, Sereda's story became intertwined with myth and propaganda. Over the years, different versions of the tale emerged. Some accounts claimed he destroyed the tank with the axe. Others said he killed the crew. The truth, while impressive enough, was more nuanced. Sereda used psychological warfare and audacity to force a surrender. After receiving his medal, Sereda continued to serve in the Red Army. He fought in numerous battles throughout the war, eventually transitioning from his role as a cook to a more combat-oriented position. He survived the war, which was itself an achievement given the staggering casualties suffered by the Soviet Union. After the war ended in 1945, Sereda returned to civilian life. Unlike some decorated war heroes who received public recognition and benefits, Sereda lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, and the fame he had briefly enjoyed faded as the Soviet Union moved on from the war years. Ivan Pavlovich Sereda died in 1982, largely forgotten by the wider public. It wasn't until decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that historians and military enthusiasts began to rediscover his story. Today, Sereda is remembered as one of the most unusual heroes of World War II, a man who proved that courage doesn't require a weapon, it requires a will to act. Sereda's story, while unique in its details, reflects a broader truth about World War II on the Eastern Front. Ordinary people were thrust into extraordinary circumstances and forced to make impossible choices. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people during the war, and countless acts of heroism went unrecorded and unrecognized. The early days of Operation Barbarossa were particularly chaotic and deadly for Soviet forces. Within weeks, the Germans had captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft, and advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. In this context, any act of resistance, no matter how small, took on enormous significance. Sereda's capture of the German tank also highlights the psychological dimensions of warfare. The German crew's decision to surrender was based on their perception of the threat they faced, not the reality. Sereda understood, whether consciously or instinctively, that creating confusion and fear could be as effective as firepower. This incident also reveals something about the Soviet military culture of the time. Soldiers were expected to fight with whatever they had, regardless of their role or equipment. The idea that a cook would attack a tank wasn't seen as absurd by Soviet standards. It was seen as a soldier doing his duty. As with many wartime stories, especially those from the Soviet Union, it's important to separate verified facts from propaganda and myth. The core elements of Sereda's story, that he was a cook, that he captured a German tank with an axe, and that he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, are supported by Soviet military records and contemporary accounts. However, some details have been embellished over time. For example, some versions of the story claim Sereda killed the German crew, which contradicts the documented fact that the crew surrendered. Other accounts suggest he destroyed the tank itself, which would have been impossible with an axe. Modern historians who have examined Soviet military archives confirm that the incident did occur and that Sereda's actions were recognized by his superiors. The award citation is genuine, and multiple witnesses from the 91st Tank Regiment corroborated the basic facts of the story. What remains remarkable, even stripped of embellishment, is the audacity of Sereda's actions. Whether he planned the attack carefully or acted on impulse, he took on a steel behemoth with a hand tool and won. That alone places him among the most unusual heroes of the war. Beyond the tactical details and the historical record, Sereda's story reminds us that war is ultimately a human experience. He wasn't a superhero or a propaganda construct. He was a cook who found himself in an impossible situation and chose to act rather than hide. What was going through his mind as he charged toward that tank? Was it fear, determination, anger, or all three? We'll never know for certain, but we can imagine the calculations he must have made, the odds of success, the consequences of failure, and the knowledge that doing nothing would mean abandoning his comrades. Sereda's story also challenges our assumptions about heroism. We often think of heroes as soldiers with rifles or pilots in fighter planes, but Sereda's weapon was an axe, and his battlefield was a forest clearing. He didn't have training for tank assault, and he didn't have backup. All he had was courage and a willingness to act when it mattered most. In the decades since the war, Sereda's story has inspired countless retellings, from Soviet propaganda films to modern documentaries. Each generation finds something different in his tale. For some, it's a symbol of Soviet resistance. For others, it's a universal story of individual bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of Ivan Pavlovich Sereda is a reminder that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people who rise to extraordinary challenges. On that June morning in 1941, a cook with an axe changed the course of a small battle and earned his place in the annals of military history. Sereda's act didn't change the outcome of World War II. The Germans continued their advance, and millions more would die before the war ended. But in that moment, on that battlefield, one man proved that courage and initiative could triumph over steel and firepower. Today, when we think of World War II heroes, we often picture the famous generals and celebrated pilots, but perhaps we should also remember the cooks, the medics, the clerks, and all the other ordinary soldiers who performed extraordinary acts of bravery. Ivan Pavlovich Sereda charged a tank with an axe and won. His story sounds like fiction, but it's all too real, a testament to what humans are capable of when pushed to their limits. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about Ivan Sereda's incredible story, make sure to check out our other videos about the unsung heroes of World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.